Hi everyone, my name is Rademeyer. I am a writer and director working in theatre and film. And for the past couple of years, I've been the mentor adjudicator for the Curro Art Superhero Write It category. And as you prepare to start writing this year, I wanted to give you some tips based on things that I've seen in the past couple of years. So the most important thing with any form of writing, so whether you're writing a poem or a short story or a monologue or a graphic novel, is clarity of meaning. Clarity is key. Make sure that the meaning you want to convey comes across clearly. Everything contributes to meaning. Vocabulary, or the words we choose, grammar, punctuation, typography. Ask yourself as you're writing, is there a better or more specific word I can use to say what I want to say? Ask yourself, have I written my sentence in such a way that the meaning is unambiguous and clear? The reader must know what is going on, and it's your job to guide them through your piece of writing. Another very important note is to show, don't tell. Okay? It's much more interesting for the reader if you use action, dialogue, subtext or metaphor to show us what the character is thinking or feeling, rather than just telling us directly. We have a tendency to tell our reader what a character is thinking or feeling, but this isn't necessarily the most interesting way to convey information. So instead of saying she was angry, where you're directly telling us how the character was feeling, you can rather say something like, she stomped up the stairs and slammed the doors shut with so much force that the windows rattled. So in the last sentence, we can see that the character is angry by describing her actions. Okay? The next important thing I want you to remember is that detail is everything. The more detailed and specific your writing is, the better. A reader will find it very difficult to connect with your work if you use vague or generalized statements or phrases. The more specific we are in describing a scenario or action or a character, the more the reader will be drawn into the world of the story. So instead of saying, after she woke up, she got dressed, try to create more of an atmosphere by being more specific. So you can say something like, she sat on her unmade bed, considering what to wear. When her mom called from downstairs, she slipped on her usual outfit, a pair of torn jeans and an oversized grey hoodie. So the overall meaning, after she woke up, she got dressed, remains the same. But using a much more specific description that you have colored in tells us something more about the character and her state of mind, instead of simply stating what her basic action of getting dressed is. Okay, then a very important note is that nothing is more frustrating for a reader than a piece of writing with a lot of unnecessary and silly mistakes. Mistakes that could have been prevented. Grammatical or spelling or typing errors really take the reader out of the experience of reading the story or poem. And for me as an adjudicator, it shows that you don't care about your work and you don't take pride in your work. So please, please, please proofread and edit your work before you submit it to try and catch unnecessary mistakes. So, a couple of things that I want you to try to avoid when you're writing. The first one is, don't assume that the reader knows what is going on. It's your job to make everything crystal clear for the reader and to guide us through your story or poem. Don't use generalizations or make vague statements. Try to be as specific as possible. Don't just start writing without any planning. Always, especially if you're writing a short story, brainstorm or plan your piece using a mind map or a structure or whatever. If a story just drifts along. It becomes very clear to the reader that no planning or forethought has gone into it. Try not to use very long or run-on sentences. Often these sentences become confusing to read and the meaning becomes muddled. Also, try not to write about topics that you don't know anything about. So if you've never been to Europe, Paris, for example, then don't write a story that is set in Paris. A reader can pick up if you don't necessarily know what you're talking about, and it takes the reader out of the story. Then a very important point is to try to stay away from sites online where anyone can submit stories or poems. Sites like these often are not regulated or monitored, so there's absolutely no control over the quality of the stories. And if we read poems or stories from sites like these, we can really pick up bad habits. So if you really want good examples of short stories or poems, look for books or compilations that have been published. If you have a school library, go to your library. If you're interested in particular types of stories, then ask your language teachers what types of books they would recommend. Okay, so now talking about poetry specifically. Generally in a poem, the journey that we want to take the reader on is an emotional one. Okay, so poetry often evokes a feeling or a mood in the reader. So ask yourself, what is the feeling that you want to create? What is the atmosphere you want to create with your poem? And then how can you use language and imagery to help you achieve that? Okay, in a poem, it is very, very important to use imagery. Okay, don't just tell us directly what is happening or what someone is thinking or what something is about. Try to use symbols or metaphor. Okay, with a poem, you really want to paint a picture in the reader's mind. You want to allow the reader to see what you're saying. If you allow the reader to see images, it stimulates our imagination and it helps to keep us engaged. Okay? And a helpful tip is to try and employ your senses when you're describing something. And this poem, which was written last year by Leandri Prinsloo, who was in grade 12 at Curro Bankenveld last year, she uses clear and creative imagery to paint a very vivid picture for the reader. So this is an extract from it. My dead aunt puts her famous rosemary chicken in the oven, the worms behind her skin eyeing my wounds. She smiles in her brown fur coat like she did in 2009. I remember calling her beautiful on her deathbed after the chemicals peeled the woman off her bones. She uses phrases like rosemary chicken in the oven, which is something the reader can almost smell, which evokes a kind of feeling in them. She uses a phrase, the worms behind her skin, which immediately paints a gruesome picture for the reader about what this dead aunt looks like. Okay? In a poem, I also want you to try and use words creatively. Poetry really allows us some freedom from strict linguistic or grammatical rules. So try to use uncommon or unique words, or words that sound like their meaning. For example, instead of saying the wind was blowing, you can rather say the wind whistled round the corner. Okay? I want to read you a longer extract from another poem from last year as well. This poem was by Vuyo Kwakweni, who was in grade 12 at Curro Century City last year. The poem is called Girls, the End of the World, and Other Peculiar Melancholies. And here's an extract from it. The swaying of the sea below the cliff slows her breaths. Salt stings her eyes as waves of memory rise and smack. Her chest caves in. She can't remember her voice. She chokes the girl's name. No one but the wind has to be subjected to the pain of names uttered with no hope of a response. She keeps saying that forbidden word. She sees little feet traipsing around their bed. She sees tiny hands wrapped around each finger. She sees closed eyes and a still chest. No wind now. He sees her tears, grunts. It wasn't a boy, because a boy would have survived. Girls, hysterical, mourn in their homes, not for dreams, those are crushed young, but mourn their daughters who will someday end up on this very cliff. In this very evocative poem, Vuyo deals not only with the loss of a child, but with issues surrounding gender. So because it deals with this topic, it's quite a political poem, but it doesn't feel that way, because Vuyo takes us on an emotional journey with the speaker in the poem. From the very first line, Vuyo uses imagery and metaphoric language to imbue the poem with atmosphere, which instantly sets the mood for the reader. She also reveals specifics in the poem gradually as the poem progresses, and this takes the reader on a journey and makes sure that the reader stays engaged. She doesn't try to use fancy words and tries to keep things simple, because there's often a lot of power in describing things in a simple way. Okay, now on to short stories. So generally in a short story, the journey that you take the reader on is a narrative one, which means they are following you through a story, okay? So your storyline or your plot and your characters are what keeps the reader engaged. The reader must feel like they are experiencing the events or situation of a story alongside the characters. Okay, so be very clear about what is happening in your story. What are the highs and lows? What are the revelations? What are the realizations that the characters have? So what are all of the major points of action that you want your reader to experience alongside the characters? So to have these plot points, it's very important that you plan and structure your story beforehand. Make sure that the storyline is very clear, that there is a sequence of events with a very clear beginning, middle, and end. If a story just rambles on and on, it feels like nothing is happening, and then it becomes difficult for the reader to stay interested. When you think about characters, I want you to try and create a clear and unique characters. When we're reading a story or when we're watching a movie, as another example, we attach to the characters. We don't necessarily attach to the location, or maybe what happens to the character is something we haven't experienced, but we attach to the character because the character is another human being that is experiencing something, and we can relate to that. Okay, we should then be able to relate to or like the major characters in your story. The main way we learn about characters in a story is firstly by how the narrator or the writer describes the character, their appearance, thoughts, desires, and then secondly through dialogue or what the character says. Okay, dialogue is extremely important because it really can help you to build specific and unique characters. Different people speak in different ways. Depending on who you are, depending on where you were born, depending on when you were born, depending on who you hang out with, you're going to use different kinds of words and different phrases. You know, someone who is in a gang is going to speak very differently from someone who's a university professor. Someone who is the popular kid or the sports star of the school is going to speak differently than someone who is shy, or someone who is a loner or keeps to themselves. Okay, so think about exactly who your characters are, and then think about how you can use dialogue or the specific kinds of words that your character uses to help to define and color in your characters. Then when writing, and this counts for poetry as well, I want you to try to use interesting nouns and verbs. So when we describe things, we tend to use adjectives and adverbs. He ran quickly, for example. But when we use too many adverbs and adjectives, a sentence can become really messy and really difficult to read. And if we put a number of adjectives in front of a noun, it starts to sound a little bit like a list. So one way to still describe something properly is to use a unique noun or verb. So instead of saying he ran quickly, you can rather say he sprinted, or he galloped, or he jetted. In those words, the verb jetted, galloped, conveys meaning. So an adverb isn't necessary. Then a very important point for a story is that a story needs to contain conflict. This does not mean that there has to be a fight in the story. It simply means that the story must have tension or dramatic action. Now, conflict or dramatic action in a story is generally generated when a character wants something, but there is an obstacle that prevents the character from achieving this goal. Okay, so the character wants something, which we call their objective, but there is an obstacle that stands in their way of achieving this thing that they want. This obstacle can be another character that prevents them from achieving their goal. It can be an external event. Maybe your character wants to be a national sports star, but they are in a car accident. Your obstacle can also be a force of nature, something like a fire or a storm, or it can be something inside of the character, him or herself. It can be something like fear or self-doubt. Okay? So when you have a character that wants something, but there's something preventing them from getting it, we're starting to create tension or conflict in the story, because then the story becomes about how the character can overcome this obstacle to still achieve what they want, and how the character reacts when something is preventing them from achieving their goal. Okay, so I want to read you the opening paragraph of a story written by Jenna Rigby, who was in grade 10 at Curro, Durbanville last year. And she opened her short story with the following paragraph. I flutter open my jade-flecked eyes to the sight of complete destruction. Crimson red flames scorched the earth, sending up clouds of grey, tainting the morning sky. Accompanying the smell of smoke is the overwhelming scent of blood and death. I'm crouched on the dirt, granules of coarse sand plastered to my sweaty skin. Littering the ground are dead bodies, their faces almost unrecognizable like faded paintings. Massacred without so much as a second thought, left to die without so much as an ounce of guilt. So in this paragraph, you can see that Jenna uses more specific or unique verbs. instead of I open my eyes, she says I flutter open my eyes. Instead of saying people were killed without a second thought, she says massacred without a second thought. So when she uses these specific kinds of verbs, it's not necessary to add unnecessary adverbs. This paragraph, it's the opening paragraph. It contains a lot of information that tells the reader where we are and what's going on. However, it doesn't feel like we're just being given background information. Jenna uses her descriptions to set the scene, but also to immediately start the action of the story. The reader is immediately placed in this chaotic environment alongside the narrator. And that happens in the first sentence. I flutter open my jade-flecked eyes to the sight of complete destruction. We also instantly get an idea of the character, her jade-flecked eyes. We are immediately told whether she's calm or tense without those two words being uttered when she says, there's sand plastered to my sweaty skin. You know, the word sweaty conveys and tells us something about the character. And what's most important for me in this opening is that it grabs the reader's attention and it makes me want to read further. I want to know what exactly is going on. How did the world end up like this? What is the main character doing in this setting, and what's going to happen to her? So this opening really creates a sense of anticipation, which leaves the reader interested. So I hope these tips and examples have been helpful. I want you to pay attention to these notes and to come back to this video as you plan and write your stories. And most importantly, I really want you to be creative and to use your imaginations. I really look forward to reading your work this year, and I can't wait to see what you come up with.